Imagine standing in front of the world and saying words you never thought you'd speak, words that sever the last tie to someone you once called family. We disown you. 3 words that carry a lifetime of weight. That's exactly what Jake Reiner, eldest son of the late Rob Reiner, has done, and the timing couldn't be more shocking. Only days after the brutal discovery of his parents' lifeless bodies in their Brentwood estate, Jake stepped forward, not to mourn publicly or plead for justice, but to deliver a declaration that would forever fracture the remaining family. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. You're probably asking yourself, what could make someone publicly disown their own brother in the aftermath of such horror? What could possibly justify severing blood ties at a moment when grief should unite rather than divide? That's exactly the question gripping not just the Reiner family, but an entire public watching, horrified and riveted. Because in this story, every layer you peel back reveals a darker, more complicated truth. The events that led up to this moment read like a script from a psychological thriller, but the implications are painfully real. Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, were discovered brutally murdered in their $13.5 million Brentwood estate on Sunday, December 14th. The cause of death was listed as multiple sharp force injuries. According to reports, the discovery was made by their daughter, Romy Reiner, 27, who immediately alerted law enforcement. What she allegedly told police was chilling. There was a dangerous family member who should be considered a suspect. Think about that for a second. In the moments after her parents' deaths, the surviving daughter had to process grief, terror, and suspicion all at once. And she pointed the finger internally, within her own family. That's a level of psychological intensity most people will never experience. Yet here it was, unfolding in one of Los Angeles' wealthiest neighborhoods. Meanwhile, Nick Reiner, 32, the son living in the guest house on the property, was arrested that very night. 2 counts of first-degree murder. The police and media have focused on him, painting a portrait of a troubled young man caught in the ultimate act of violence. But the story doesn't stop there. Because Nick's alleged crimes are only one layer of a much deeper, more complicated family drama. While the world watches the trial, a different story is being told behind closed doors. One that involves loyalty, betrayal, and the moral calculus of family relationships. And it's in this hidden layer that Jake Reiner's announcement takes on its full meaning. This wasn't a casual statement. It wasn't a press release drafted by lawyers to manage optics. This was a personal, irrevocable decision, made at a moment when most would have leaned on their family for support, not sever ties. And yet, Jake did the unthinkable. Let's step back for a moment. Why should this story matter to you, the viewer? Because it's about more than a crime. It's about what happens when grief intersects with moral responsibility. It's about the moments when silence becomes complicity, and the courage to speak truth can cost you the people you love most. And perhaps most importantly, it's about the human fascination with family breakdowns, because we all want to understand how loyalty can collapse under pressure and why betrayal sometimes comes from the people we trust the most. Now, let's talk about timing, because timing makes everything in this story so much more intense. The murders happened in December, but the announcement came days later. The arrest was made, the autopsy results released, the police statements filed. Every piece of new information was another turn of the knife, both figuratively and, tragically, literally. Jake's words didn't just land in the midst of a scandal. They landed in a raw, bleeding wound, one that was already exposed to the world. And the content of what he said? Even more shocking than the timing itself. The beauty of storytelling, especially in long-form, immersive reporting, is in how it builds anticipation. I'm going to tell you Jake's exact words later. But first, you need to understand the family dynamic that created this fissure. You need to know about the parents, their relationships with each child, and the patterns of interaction that shaped everything leading up to that night in December. Because without that context, Jake's decision might seem sudden, even cruel. But with context, you realize it was, in his mind, inevitable. Grief changes people. Trauma reshapes perception. And in families like the Reiners, where power, legacy, and personal history intersect, every action has magnified consequences. Imagine losing the anchors of your life, your parents, suddenly and violently. Now imagine discovering that the person closest to those events, your sibling, may have been involved. Now imagine that sibling isn't just under suspicion, but is someone whose past behavior, patterns, and choices have already raised serious alarms. It's in that context that Jake's declaration becomes almost a necessity rather than an act of cold-heartedness. We also have to acknowledge the public aspect of this announcement. Jake didn't make a private call. He didn't confine his statement to a family group chat. This was out in the open, a public disownment that forces the world, and, more importantly, the media, to witness his decision. That's a psychological act as much as it is a familial one. When someone chooses to go public with a private judgment, it amplifies the impact, magnifies the scrutiny, and ensures that the conversation about loyalty, morality, and justice becomes communal. The family is no longer private. It is a narrative, a story that every viewer, every reporter, every social media commentator can analyze and dissect. But what about the psychological weight on Jake himself? What does it take to say to the world that you no longer consider your brother part of your family, especially when the world is still reeling from the murder of your parents? We can speculate, based on interviews, statements, and human behavior, that this is not a decision made lightly. The emotional labor involved is staggering. It's grief layered with fear, trauma, and moral conviction, all converging into a single act of public judgment. And yet, Jake did it. And that brings us to another crucial point: the human fascination with family drama. Why do we watch? Why do we read? Why do we become riveted by these stories? Partly because we recognize ourselves in them. We have families. We have conflicts, tensions, and betrayals. Most of us will never face the horrors of a double homicide within our own home, but we have all experienced moments of moral decision within the family context. Moments when loyalty clashes with ethics, when silence is complicit, when saying the truth might destroy what we hold dear. This is the psychological mirror that makes the Reiner story so gripping. So where does that leave us at the start of this journey? We have a brutal crime. We have a suspect within the family. We have surviving siblings facing impossible choices. And we have an eldest son, Jake, who chose to publicly disown his brother, cutting him off in a way that can never be undone. The stage is set for a story that isn't just about murder. It's about morality, loyalty, grief, and the way human beings navigate impossible situations. And before we move forward, before we dive into the timelines, the family history, and the shocking moments leading up to Jake's announcement, let me leave you with a question. What would you do if you were in Jake's shoes? How far would you go to protect the memory of your parents, the integrity of your family, and the moral truth as you see it? Could you publicly sever ties with someone you love, someone you grew up with, someone who is, by every definition, your blood? Think about it, because the story we're about to explore isn't just a series of events. It's a psychological labyrinth, and by the end, you'll understand why no one walked away from this moment unchanged. The night of December 14th started like any other in Brentwood, a neighborhood of sprawling estates, manicured lawns, and the quiet hum of luxury living. But inside the Reiner estate, the calm was deceptive. By sunrise, everything had changed. 2 lives were gone, brutally taken. 2 pillars of a family, parents, mentors, protectors, were gone. And the shockwave would ripple through a household and eventually the world. Imagine walking through your front door to find a scene that defies comprehension. That's what Romy Reiner allegedly faced that night. She had gone to check on her parents and, according to reports, immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. The first moments were not about reasoning or investigation. They were raw, gut-wrenching panic. The adrenaline, the horror, the disbelief, all collided at once. And then she saw them. Her parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, both lifeless. The cause of death would later be confirmed as multiple sharp force injuries, a violent end that shocked not only the family but the entire community. What happens to a family in those first few moments after discovering such a scene? There's an instinctual mix of grief, fear, and disbelief. You freeze. You scream. You call for help. You pray it isn't real. Romy's immediate reaction, according to sources, was precise. She called the police. But what she reportedly said next added another layer of tension to an already unthinkable situation. She spoke of a dangerous family member, someone who, in her estimation, should be considered a suspect. Imagine the horror of saying that in the aftermath of your parents' deaths, pointing to a sibling, someone you grew up with, someone you loved. That moment marked the beginning of a fracture that would define the remaining days for the Reiner family. While Romy was processing shock and fear, law enforcement mobilized quickly. The Brentwood area is no stranger to high-profile incidents, but this was different. The combination of celebrity status, wealth, and the brutality of the crime created a media frenzy. Helicopters buzzed overhead, reporters staked out the estate gates, and social media exploded with speculation. But inside the property, the scene was horrifyingly intimate. Investigators would later describe the estate as chaotic, not in the sense of destruction, but in the sense of lives violently interrupted. Bedrooms, living spaces, and personal areas became a crime scene, each room a puzzle to be meticulously documented. Every photograph taken, every fingerprint lifted, every item cataloged would play a role in piecing together the final hours of Rob and Michelle Reiner. Meanwhile, Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son living in the guest house on the property, would become the immediate focus of the investigation. According to reports, he was taken into custody that night, facing 2 counts of first-degree murder. But the arrest was not merely procedural, it was symbolic. The family's private tragedy was now a public spectacle, and it raised questions that would haunt not just Nick, but the surviving siblings, the extended family, and even close friends. How does a family navigate the trauma of losing parents while simultaneously grappling with suspicion among themselves? How do you process grief when the person you might blame is someone you were supposed to trust the most? The night of the murders was punctuated by silence that seemed almost deafening. Wealth, influence, and status mean nothing when confronted with mortality in such a sudden, violent way. The quiet of the estate, once a sanctuary, became oppressive. And within that quiet, the surviving family members, especially Jake, the eldest son, faced a new reality, a moral and emotional reckoning that demanded action. What should you do when faced with the possibility that someone you love could have committed the unthinkable? How do you reconcile grief with suspicion? How do you respond when the world is watching and every decision you make is scrutinized under a microscope? Adding another layer of complexity, the media began piecing together timelines, interviews, and speculative reports. The public narrative began to form almost immediately: a wealthy family, a violent crime, a suspect who lived under the same roof as the victims. But these external narratives could never capture the private horror, the intimate chaos, or the profound emotional impact on the surviving children. That night was not just the end of 2 lives. It was the beginning of a psychological war that would challenge every relationship, every loyalty, every unspoken assumption within the family. One particularly chilling aspect of the night, according to insiders, was the realization that this wasn't a random act of violence. There were no signs of forced entry. The scene suggested familiarity, someone who knew the estate, the routines, the people inside. That detail, subtle yet devastating, implied that the threat came from within, and it amplified Romy's immediate fear and suspicion. For law enforcement, this information was critical. For the surviving children, it was devastating. Because knowing the perpetrator could be a family member forces a confrontation with the unimaginable. Betrayal is no longer theoretical, it is tangible. And yet, even amid terror and grief, life demanded action. Romy had to speak to police. She had to give statements, recount observations, and provide timelines. Every word mattered. Every pause, every hesitation, every inflection would be analyzed, not just by law enforcement, but later by the media and the public. Imagine the weight of that responsibility on someone who had just lost both parents in a horrifying way. How do you process grief while simultaneously performing what amounts to an interrogation? How do you maintain composure when your every word could shape the fate of a family member? Meanwhile, the estate itself became a repository of evidence. Investigators meticulously documented every detail, from fingerprints to personal belongings, from potential motives to behavioral patterns. The guest house where Nick resided was examined thoroughly. Security logs, timestamps, and interviews began to paint a complex picture of life in the estate prior to the murders. Each layer uncovered new questions, new tensions, and new revelations that would eventually influence public perception and internal family dynamics. And then there was Jake. As the eldest son, he faced a unique burden that night. He had to navigate grief, manage his own emotions, and assess the integrity of his remaining family ties. Eldest children in high-stakes family dynamics often carry an unspoken responsibility, a duty to protect, to lead, and sometimes to make impossible decisions. Jake's actions that night, while less visible to the public, would become the cornerstone of his later announcement. The seeds of his disownment of Nick were planted here, in the chaos of grief and suspicion, as he grappled with a moral imperative: protect the memory of his parents, preserve the integrity of the family, and confront the possibility that loyalty and love could not coexist with justice. And while the world focused on the gruesome details of the crime, the Reiner family was confronting an equally terrifying truth. Trust within their own ranks had been fractured irrevocably. Every conversation, every glance, every interaction would now be tainted by suspicion. Who could be relied upon? Who might betray them further? How does one grieve when the potential perpetrator is not only known, but possibly a sibling? It is a psychological minefield, one that most families are fortunate never to encounter. The night of December 14th, therefore, was not just the night of a tragic double homicide. It was the night when a family began to fracture under pressure, when allegiances shifted, when the public and private worlds collided in ways that would have long-lasting consequences. It was a night that forced difficult questions. What is loyalty when morality is at stake? What is justice when the perpetrator is family? And ultimately, how do you survive emotionally when everything you once believed about safety, love, and family is upended in an instant? And yet, even in this darkness, a pattern began to emerge. Romy's immediate actions, the police investigation, the arrest of Nick, and Jake's internal reckoning all converged to create a narrative that was more than just a crime story. It was a psychological thriller, a drama of morality, and a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust within even the most seemingly secure families. Every decision made that night would echo for months, years, perhaps a lifetime. But what happened next? The next hours, the next revelations, and the first public reactions would change everything. The quiet horror of that night set the stage, but the real story, the story of declarations, disownment, and moral reckoning, was only beginning to unfold. And no one outside the estate could have predicted just how profoundly those events would reshape the Reiner family forever. The night had ended, but the war had just begun. She didn't scream. She didn't panic in the way most people might expect. Instead, Romy Reiner, 27, allegedly made a decision in the split second after discovering her parents' bodies that would define the trajectory of the investigation and her family's future. She picked up the phone, and what she said next has been described by insiders as chilling, deliberate, and horrifyingly precise. She identified a dangerous family member. She named someone who, in her estimation, should be considered a suspect. Think about the gravity of that moment. Imagine standing in a room where your parents have just been violently murdered. The blood, the shock, the incomprehensible sight of life abruptly ended. And then, on top of that, you have to confront a terrifying truth. The threat is within your own family. That's what Romy faced. And the clarity of her actions, the decisiveness in pointing to a suspect, demonstrates not only courage, but a level of cold, rational thinking that's almost inconceivable under those circumstances. But why did she act so quickly? According to reports, Romy had been aware of family tensions for years. The dynamics between her parents and their children were complicated, layered with love, rivalry, and occasional fear. Nick, the son living in the guest house, had a history that allegedly concerned her, patterns of behavior that hinted at volatility. These aren't wild rumors. They're accounts drawn from friends, neighbors, and investigative sources who describe a young man who was quiet, private, and at times unpredictable. And when the tragedy occurred, Romy's instincts, honed by years of observation, led her to act decisively. When police arrived at the estate, they found Romy already composed, already prepared to give detailed statements. Her composure was striking, considering the horror she had just encountered. Sources indicate that she provided timestamps, noted unusual behaviors, and described the last known movements of her parents in the hours leading up to their deaths. Every piece of information she offered was scrutinized by investigators, who had to balance shock, grief, and urgency in their response. Her phone call to law enforcement wasn't just about reporting a crime. It was a psychological act, a declaration that she was stepping into a role that demanded responsibility and clarity. In families, especially wealthy or high-profile families like the Reiners, there is often a tension between private loyalty and public accountability. Romy's choice to call the police and to name a family member represents a breaking point where private loyalty yields to moral necessity. And yet, the decision came with consequences. Naming a suspect from within the family, even under suspicion, is fraught with peril. It risks the permanent rupture of relationships. It risks social judgment. It risks emotional backlash from those who might not understand the full context. Romy's call was both an act of bravery and a seismic shift in the family dynamic. Because from that point forward, the Reiners could never see each other the same way again. Police sources indicate that Romy's description of the scene was meticulous. She reportedly detailed the exact location of her parents, the apparent nature of their injuries, and anomalies she observed in the estate. Even small details, a misplaced object, a door left open, a personal belonging out of place, became critical pieces of evidence. In high-profile investigations like this, every observation matters, and Romy's immediate attention to detail reportedly helped investigators reconstruct a timeline more quickly than would have been possible otherwise. Yet, even as Romy cooperated with the authorities, the emotional toll was immense. She had just lost both parents in a shocking, violent manner, and at the same time, she had to manage fear for her own safety, process the reality that her brother was a prime suspect, and navigate a media storm that was already beginning to swell outside the gates of the estate. The psychological weight is almost impossible to overstate. In most cases, trauma causes confusion and hesitation. Romy's response, according to multiple accounts, was unusually precise and courageous. The content of her statements allegedly went beyond merely identifying a suspect. She reportedly provided context that suggested long-standing concerns about Nick's behavior, patterns of isolation, and moments of aggression. This information, while deeply personal, became a critical part of the investigation, helping law enforcement understand not only the immediate crime, but the familial landscape in which it occurred. Think about the courage required for that. Every word she spoke could be used in court, every observation would later be dissected by lawyers and media, and every statement carried emotional risk. In a moment of grief, Romy made a conscious decision to prioritize truth and justice over comfort, over denial, over familial protection. And that choice would shape not only the legal outcomes, but the moral narrative of the Reiner family. There's also the aspect of public perception. In high-profile families, the immediate aftermath of a tragedy is often a performance, an attempt to control narrative. Romy's decisiveness, however, made it impossible to obscure the reality. Her choice to call the police, name a suspect, and cooperate fully became a foundational moment in the story. It signaled to the world that the Reiners were not attempting to shield one another from scrutiny, that the gravity of the crime superseded traditional family loyalty. However, the weight of pointing to a family member cannot be underestimated. For Romy, the emotional impact extended far beyond that phone call. According to reports, in the hours following the discovery, she experienced what psychologists describe as secondary trauma, a combination of grief and guilt, a fear that perhaps her actions could contribute to familial disintegration, and an anxiety about the long-term consequences of publicly implicating her brother. It's critical to note the timing of her call. Early in the night, before external pressures from media and law enforcement intensified, Romy acted. That immediacy gave investigators critical insights, allowed for rapid response, and arguably prevented the scene from being further compromised. But it also crystallized the division within the family, highlighting fractures that may have been simmering beneath the surface for years. In the broader context, Romy's call exemplifies the tension between instinct and duty, grief and morality. Her decision reflects a rare form of courage, the willingness to confront the unimaginable, speak difficult truths, and take responsibility for actions that could never be undone. It's a theme that will echo throughout the Reiner family narrative, especially as her elder brother Jake steps into the public eye with his own irrevocable decisions. Her actions also set the stage for the media storm that would follow. Journalists quickly picked up on the detail that a family member had been identified as a suspect. Social media users speculated about motives, timelines, and relationships. The court of public opinion began forming narratives almost immediately. And through it all, Romy remained a figure of composure and resolve, managing not just her own grief, but the expectations and curiosity of a global audience. Yet even with that composure, the psychological strain was intense. Sources suggest that Romy spent the hours after her call in reflection, shock, and careful consideration of the consequences. Every action, every word, every choice would reverberate through the family and eventually feed into the moral and emotional decisions of her brother Jake. Because of Romy's decisive call, investigators could move quickly to Nick, gather evidence from the guest house, and begin constructing a timeline that would eventually support his arrest. Her immediate decision to act responsibly created a foundation for justice, but also illuminated a truth that would haunt the surviving family members. Loyalty and protection are not always compatible with justice and accountability. And it's here that the narrative takes its first major twist. Romy's call, intended as a step toward clarity, also inadvertently escalated the moral and emotional stakes for the Reiner siblings. Suddenly, the family was no longer unified by shared grief. It was divided by suspicion, fear, and the terrifying reality that the person who may have caused the deaths of their parents was someone they knew intimately. Every step taken after that phone call, the arrival of police, the securing of the estate, the collection of evidence, was informed by Romy's initial observations. She had acted with foresight, clarity, and courage. But even as law enforcement moved into action, the emotional consequences within the family were only beginning to unfold. Trust had been broken. Fear had entered the home, and the stage was set for Jake Reiner's eventual public declaration, a declaration that could only happen because the fractures Romy exposed could no longer be ignored. That night, Romy's actions were more than procedural. They were transformative. She set in motion a chain of events that would lead to arrests, legal investigations, and ultimately, moral reckonings. Her phone call was the first domino to fall, a moment of truth that revealed both the horror of the crime and the precariousness of family bonds. But what she couldn't anticipate, and what the rest of the family would soon confront, was how that single phone call would amplify tension, accelerate suspicion, and force Jake Reiner into a position where he would have to make an unthinkable choice. The night had ended, the first call had been made, and the first truths revealed, but what came next would challenge loyalty, morality, and the very definition of family. Nick Reiner was, by all outward appearances, the quiet one. The son who lived in the guest house, who kept to himself, who rarely drew attention in a family otherwise defined by personalities that were larger than life. To friends, neighbors, and even some family members, Nick seemed reserved, contemplative, even aloof. He wasn't the type to dominate conversations or seek the spotlight. But beneath that quiet exterior, according to sources, there were patterns, behaviors, and moments that hinted at something more complicated. Something that would later become central to the most shocking events in the Reiner family's history. What drives a quiet person to commit acts that shock everyone who knows them? Is it isolation, resentment, long-simmering anger, or something darker? These are the questions that investigators, psychologists, and family members alike began asking in the days and weeks after the murders. Nick's life up until that point had been, by many accounts, relatively unremarkable. He had lived in the guest house for years, maintaining a degree of independence, perhaps a desire for distance, perhaps an unconscious distancing from family drama. But the events of December 14th revealed that the surface calm had masked deeper complexities that would soon be examined under an unforgiving spotlight. Nick's relationships within the family were nuanced. With his parents, he was reportedly polite, but not particularly close. He had moments of warmth, but also moments of distance, silence, and apparent indifference. Siblings described him as difficult to read, someone who rarely expressed anger openly, but whose moods could shift unpredictably. These dynamics, seemingly minor in everyday life, suddenly took on immense significance. When tragedy struck, the quiet one became the focal point, the center of suspicion, the individual whose behavior and past actions were dissected to make sense of a horrifying crime. The guest house where Nick lived became a key element in the investigation. It was close enough to the main house that he had access, but separate enough that his movements could be less observed by others. Investigators noted that the layout, the proximity, and the access points made it a crucial piece of the puzzle in determining how events unfolded. Security footage, timestamps, and neighbor observations would later suggest that Nick's routine had been consistent with previous behavior, yet the critical moments surrounding the murders would ultimately place him under suspicion. The combination of opportunity, motive, and timing, classical components in any criminal investigation, would converge in ways that painted a chilling picture. But Nick's quiet nature wasn't just about personality, it was also about perception. People often misread quiet individuals as harmless or compliant. They assume that silence equates to passivity, that introversion equals innocence. But in many cases, quiet can conceal complexity, tension, and, in extreme situations, the capacity for unexpected violence. In the Reiner family, Nick's silence became both a shield and a source of suspicion. Those who observed him closely noticed patterns of withdrawal, private behavior that didn't always align with public perception. And when the murders occurred, that silence became a critical piece of the narrative, suggesting premeditation, planning, or at minimum, a detachment from empathy that investigators were eager to explore. Neighbors recalled that Nick often kept odd hours, leaving the guest house at unconventional times, returning late at night, or retreating entirely for days at a time. While these behaviors were not illegal and could be explained by work or personal preference, they painted a picture of someone somewhat removed from the familial sphere. In the aftermath of the murders, these patterns were reinterpreted. Actions that once seemed mundane or typical became potentially incriminating. Silence, once a personal quirk, became part of a puzzle that authorities were determined to solve. Psychologists and behavioral analysts would later discuss Nick's demeanor as part of a broader family dynamic. In families of high profile and wealth, there is often immense pressure to conform, to perform, to maintain a facade of civility and success. Individuals who resist or withdraw from that pressure may be perceived as odd, difficult, or even threatening. In Nick's case, his quietness could have been interpreted as a coping mechanism, a way to navigate family expectations, or something more ominous. The intersection of personality and circumstance became central to understanding the tragedy that unfolded. Nick's relationship with his parents, particularly Rob Reiner, has been described as polite but distant. There were no major public disputes, no documented fights, no overt signs of resentment. Yet the private realm, as is often the case, held complexities unseen by outsiders. Family members noted that while he was generally respectful, Nick had moments of tension, brief flashes of irritability or frustration, and times when he seemed disconnected from the family's collective life. These subtle cues, invisible to casual observers, would become significant in reconstructing the psychological landscape of that fateful night. The night of December 14th, all of these factors, the quiet nature, the independence, the proximity of the guest house, the patterns of withdrawal, converged in a way that would ultimately place Nick at the center of the investigation. Investigators reportedly focused on him not because of bias or assumption, but because the evidence, timing, and context pointed to someone intimately familiar with the estate and its routines. It was a classic example of opportunity intersecting with motive and means, a convergence that tragically set the stage for his arrest. And yet, even in the wake of suspicion, there were contradictions. Those who knew Nick well emphasized that he was not violent, that he had no criminal history, and that he often seemed more introspective than confrontational. These contradictions fueled public fascination. How could the quiet, unassuming son be implicated in such a violent act? How could someone perceived as harmless become the prime suspect in a crime so horrifying? These questions captivated media outlets, social platforms, and the public imagination, highlighting the complex interplay between perception, personality, and reality. In the immediate aftermath, the family faced profound shock and confusion. Romy had named him as a potential suspect. Investigators had focused on him. The world was watching. And Jake, the eldest son, was forced into a moral and emotional reckoning. He had to assess whether the brother he had grown up with could truly be responsible for the deaths of their parents. The quiet nature that once made Nick seem benign now required Jake to confront a horrifying possibility, that a person who had been close in blood could also be the perpetrator of a horrific act. Nick's case illustrates a broader psychological truth. Quietness is not synonymous with innocence. Patterns of withdrawal, introspection, or detachment can conceal complexities unseen by others, and in extreme circumstances, those complexities can intersect with tragedy in ways that defy expectation. For the Reiners, the quiet son became the focal point, the pivot upon which suspicion, grief, and familial fracture turned. The tragedy also forced the public to grapple with uncomfortable questions about personality, perception, and violence. How many families have quiet members whose inner lives are unknown? How often do we misread silence as harmlessness, when it may conceal layers of emotional or psychological complexity? In the case of the Reiners, these questions were not abstract. They were intimately tied to life, death, and justice. And it's here that we see the first moral and emotional fractures forming within the family. While Nick was taken into custody and questioned, the surviving siblings began to process what this meant for their own relationships. Romy's decision to call the police, Jake's growing realization of the gravity of the situation, and the public scrutiny combined to create a pressure cooker of fear, grief, and moral reckoning. What could loyalty mean when trust was shattered? Could love survive suspicion? Or would the family inevitably be divided by circumstance and choice? Nick Reiner, the quiet son, became more than just a suspect. He became a symbol of family complexity, of hidden emotions, of the ways in which appearances can be deceptive. And while investigators worked tirelessly to gather evidence, interview witnesses, and reconstruct the night's events, the surviving family members faced their own personal investigation, one of conscience, loyalty, and moral judgment. The quiet nature that had once defined him now became a focal point for scrutiny. Actions that might have been innocent were reinterpreted under the harsh light of suspicion. Patterns of behavior, long ignored or explained away, became critical puzzle pieces. And in that intense scrutiny, the stage was set for the most shocking declaration of all, Jake Reiner's public disownment of his own brother, a moment that would redefine the family dynamic forever. Nick's story is a reminder that tragedy is rarely simple, that human behavior is complex, and that appearances can be deceiving. The quiet son, once unnoticed, became central to a narrative that intertwined grief, justice, and moral reckoning in ways that no one could have anticipated. But what comes next? The decisions of the surviving siblings, the public reaction, and the moral choices that follow would change everything. And Jake Reiner would soon step into a role that no one else could fill, confronting truths that would lead him to a decision so final, so irrevocable, that it would shock the world. The handcuffs clicked, and in that moment, the Reiner family's world shattered. What had been speculation, fear, and uncertainty suddenly became undeniable reality. Nick Reiner, the son who had quietly lived in the guest house, was officially arrested. 2 counts of first-degree murder. The headline alone was enough to stop anyone in their tracks. But for the surviving siblings, especially Jake and Romy, the arrest was more than news. It was a seismic emotional earthquake. The gravity of the situation was impossible to overstate. The person suspected of brutally murdering their parents wasn't a stranger. It wasn't someone outside the family. It was someone whose blood ran in their veins, someone they had grown up with, someone they had trusted. From the moment law enforcement arrived at the Brentwood estate, the arrest was methodical. Officers reportedly worked with painstaking care, balancing the need for immediate custody with the desire to avoid further trauma to the surviving family members. Neighbors and onlookers were kept at a distance, but even from afar, the tension was palpable. Helicopters hovered overhead, flashing lights bathed the estate in stark illumination, and reporters began the inevitable countdown to a media frenzy. For Jake, witnessing his brother being led away in handcuffs must have been surreal. almost cinematic in its horror. But the reality behind the scene was far more complex and gut-wrenching. What makes a family tragedy of this magnitude so difficult to navigate is the collision of grief and suspicion. On one hand, Jake and Romy had lost their parents in a violent, unimaginable way. On the other, the primary suspect was someone they had shared childhoods, holidays, and family milestones with. That juxtaposition forces a psychological crisis. How do you process love and horror simultaneously? How do you grieve someone while fearing another? And how do you make decisions when every choice feels morally fraught? Investigators, according to sources, treated the arrest as a critical juncture in the investigation. The evidence they had compiled, from security footage, timelines, witness statements, and forensic analysis, pointed toward Nick as the most likely suspect. But even with evidence mounting, the arrest alone could not answer the deeper, more troubling questions. What had motivated this act? How long had tensions been simmering beneath the surface? And perhaps most importantly, how would the surviving siblings respond to the unimaginable reality that their own brother might have been capable of murder? The moment of arrest also created an immediate media spectacle. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and social media lit up with speculation. For the Reiner family, this was more than just legal scrutiny. It was a public dissection of grief. The private horror of loss was transformed into a headline, a narrative, and a moral debate. Every gesture, every expression, every reaction of the surviving children became material for public consumption. And for Jake, the eldest son, the stakes were uniquely high. He was suddenly forced to consider his own moral and familial responsibilities in a context that was now global. In addition to the emotional complexity, there was a legal dimension that could not be ignored. First-degree murder charges carry the implication of premeditation, intent, and planning. In the minds of investigators and prosecutors, this was not a crime of passion, it was calculated. That realization deepened the psychological strain for the family. If Nick was capable of planning such a horrific act, it meant that warning signs, however subtle, may have existed for years. It forced surviving family members to interrogate memories, interactions, and past behaviors in search of explanations, justifications, or patterns that might have indicated danger. Neighbors and friends offered conflicting accounts. Some described Nick as quiet, reserved, even reclusive. Others recalled moments of volatility, sudden irritability, or social withdrawal. In isolation, these behaviors might seem innocuous. But in the context of the murder investigation, every minor anecdote took on heightened significance. What had once been interpreted as personality quirks now appeared as potential warning signs, and the quiet son suddenly became a figure under intense scrutiny. The arrest also forced the family to confront the public and private dichotomy of grief. In private, they were mourning parents, navigating a household disrupted by violence, and processing shock and fear. In public, they were symbols of tragedy, the faces of a high-profile family in crisis. The tension between private mourning and public perception created an almost unbearable pressure. Every decision, every word, and every gesture had consequences that extended beyond personal grief. It's important to note that arrests of family members are rarely clean or simple. Law enforcement must balance the need for swift action with the potential emotional fallout. In the case of the Reiners, this balance was particularly delicate. Officers reportedly coordinated closely with the surviving siblings, ensuring that they had support while also securing the suspect. This combination of empathy and procedure is essential, but it can also heighten tension. Witnessing a sibling being taken into custody, knowing the charges, and realizing the legal implications can generate intense feelings of fear, guilt, and even disbelief. For Jake, the arrest was a turning point. It marked the beginning of a moral journey he would soon have to navigate publicly. He had to weigh loyalty against justice, love against morality, and family bonds against the need for accountability. These aren't decisions anyone makes lightly, especially not in the wake of such trauma. But in the Reiner family, Jake was increasingly aware that silence or inaction could have consequences far beyond the immediate tragedy. At the same time, the arrest amplified media attention in ways that transformed the family's grief into a narrative spectacle. Every article, Every broadcast segment, every social media post dissected the arrest, speculated on motives, and scrutinized familial relationships. The surviving siblings were forced into roles they never anticipated, as witnesses, as moral arbiters, and as public figures navigating a narrative that was out of their control. For Jake, this created additional pressure. He was no longer just grieving a brother. He was navigating the moral and emotional responsibilities of being the eldest son under the unblinking gaze of the world. The arrest also set off internal family reckonings. Conversations that might have been private, questions about loyalty, responsibility, and trust suddenly became urgent. How could the family reconcile love with suspicion? Could they grieve collectively when one sibling was under arrest for the ultimate betrayal? And in the background of all this, Jake began formulating the decision that would become a defining moment, the choice to publicly disown Nick, severing familial bonds in a way that would shock everyone. Legal experts and psychologists alike have noted that arrests in family contexts create unique dynamics. The combination of grief, fear, and moral complexity forces family members to confront questions they might otherwise avoid. The Reiners, already grappling with trauma, now faced an additional burden, navigating the psychological terrain of betrayal and justice while under public scrutiny. The arrest wasn't merely an event. It was a catalyst, a pivot point, and a lens through which the remaining siblings would evaluate not only Nick's actions, but their own responsibilities and moral choices. Even in the immediate aftermath, small details created tension. Security footage, timelines, and witness statements were collected, each piece analyzed for clues. Items in the estate, minor inconsistencies in behavior, and even previous interactions were revisited. For the family, this meant reliving moments of tension, disagreement, and quiet suspicion, each memory reframed in light of the arrest. The psychological burden was immense, layering grief with guilt, fear, and the dawning realization that trust had been irrevocably broken. For the public, the arrest simplified a complex story. A quiet son allegedly commits a violent act. But for the Reiners themselves, it was far more complicated. The arrest created moral ambiguity, emotional tension, and a crisis of loyalty. Every sibling now had to ask themselves questions they had never imagined. Could we have seen this coming? Should we have acted differently? And most importantly, how do we navigate relationships when the person accused is someone we grew up with, someone whose blood runs through our veins? Jake, as the eldest son, shouldered the heaviest burden. While Romy had acted decisively in calling the police, Jake now had to confront the implications of the arrest on family integrity. The arrest was not just about law enforcement. It was about moral and emotional reckoning. It was about deciding how to respond to betrayal, how to honor the memory of parents lost in violence, and how to navigate a moral landscape that had suddenly become treacherous in public. In essence, the arrest shattered more than just the immediate family dynamic. It shattered expectations, assumptions, and the very idea that familial loyalty could be absolute. It created a moral vacuum in which difficult, irreversible decisions had to be made. And within that vacuum, Jake began to confront a truth that would lead to the moment the world would later witness: the public disownment of his brother, a decision born of grief, moral clarity, and an unflinching sense of justice. The arrest was the point of no return. Once the handcuffs clicked, the narrative shifted irreversibly. What had been fear and suspicion became fact, and the surviving siblings were forced to navigate a new reality. One that demanded courage, clarity, and decisions that would shape their lives forever. But even as the handcuffs clicked and the legal process began, one question lingered over the Reiner family. How do you confront a truth so horrifying that it forces you to choose between love and morality? And how do you survive emotionally when the person you may have trusted the most has become the epicenter of a nightmare? The arrest had ended one chapter, but it had also begun the most difficult chapter yet, a chapter of moral reckoning, public scrutiny, and decisions that would leave no family member unchanged. The weight of responsibility often falls heaviest on the eldest. In the Reiner family, that burden now rested squarely on Jake Reiner's shoulders. The arrests had been made, the estate secured, and the world watching, but the private reckoning within the family was just beginning. Jake, eldest son of Rob and Michelle Reiner, found himself at a crossroads. How do you respond when the person suspected of taking the lives of your parents is your own brother? How do you navigate grief when loyalty and morality collide? And most terrifyingly, how do you act when every choice carries irreversible consequences? Jake had always been seen as the steadying force in the family, the calm, thoughtful eldest child who balanced the personalities of his siblings and mediated conflicts. But the events of December 14th had disrupted that equilibrium completely. The quiet of grief, the chaos of suspicion, and the glaring eyes of the public created a pressure cooker of moral and emotional complexity. Jake could no longer simply observe. He had to act, and his actions would define not just the family's trajectory, but the moral compass by which the surviving siblings would navigate the aftermath. What does it mean to step forward in a moment like this? To make a declaration that cuts through grief and suspicion and addresses a truth everyone fears to speak aloud. For Jake, stepping forward meant confronting not only his brother's alleged actions, but also the reality of the family fracture. It meant publicly acknowledging what was unspeakable in private, that loyalty has limits, that love can be tested, and that sometimes the path of righteousness demands painful choices. Sources close to the family indicate that Jake's decision was neither sudden nor impulsive. In the hours and days following the murders, he reportedly spent long nights reflecting on the past, analyzing interactions with Nick, and weighing the evidence gathered by law enforcement. The quiet son, who had lived in the guest house, who had once seemed harmless and reserved, was now at the center of a horrifying narrative. For Jake, the challenge was not just legal or procedural. It was moral, psychological, and profoundly personal. The moment he stepped forward, Jake did so with a clarity that many found striking. According to insiders, he did not speak in anger or vengeance. Instead, his words were measured, deliberate, and grounded in a moral framework that prioritized justice, integrity, and the preservation of family values. Even in the wake of unimaginable tragedy, he had seen the evidence, understood the risks, and recognized the emotional consequences. And yet, despite the personal cost, he chose to act. This was not a public relations move. It was not a staged announcement or a calculated media appearance. Jake's declaration was, at its core, an act of moral courage. In families, especially high-profile families under intense scrutiny, such acts are exceedingly rare. The pressure to remain silent, to protect appearances, or to defer to legal processes is immense. But Jake's choice demonstrated that sometimes morality demands action, even when it is painful, unpopular, and irreversible. The content of Jake's statement shocked the world. According to multiple reports, he said, "We disown you." 3 words, heavy with consequence, delivered in a context that magnified their impact exponentially. The phrase carries more than legal or social weight. It carries emotional finality. Disownment is not merely a withdrawal of affection. It is a severing of identity, a declaration that the bonds of blood are no longer sufficient to preserve trust or moral alignment. For Nick, the implications were profound. For Jake, the decision was both liberating and agonizing. Psychologists and family experts note that disownment is rarely about anger alone. It is often a culmination of fear, moral judgment, grief, and the perception that continued connection would compromise integrity or safety. In the Reiner case, the decision to disown Nick was influenced by multiple factors: the alleged severity of his actions, the perceived threat to the surviving siblings, and the need to protect the memory of their parents. Jake's choice reflects a complex calculus, one that balances love, justice, and moral responsibility in a context of extreme emotional duress. The reaction within the family, though private, was reportedly intense. Romy, having already acted decisively in calling the police, understood the necessity of Jake's declaration. For her, it was a confirmation that the family's remaining members were aligned in their moral response to the tragedy. But even within that alignment, the emotional cost was staggering. Disownment is not just a statement. It is an emotional act that reverberates through memory, identity, and family dynamics. Every interaction, every past memory, every shared experience becomes reframed in light of the decision. For the public, Jake's declaration added another layer to the already complex narrative. Media outlets immediately highlighted the statement. Social media erupted, and viewers around the world were forced to confront the reality that familial bonds could be severed so decisively in the wake of tragedy. The story was no longer solely about murder. It was about morality, courage, and the painful choices required to uphold ethical integrity under extraordinary circumstances. Jake's decision also illustrates the psychological weight of leadership within a family. Eldest children often carry implicit responsibilities to protect younger siblings, to mediate conflict, and to act as moral anchors. In extreme situations, these responsibilities intensify. Jake's public disownment of Nick represents an extraordinary instance of leadership under duress. It is a decision born of reflection, courage, and an understanding that some truths are too significant to remain unspoken. Interestingly, sources suggest that Jake did not take the decision lightly. He reportedly reviewed every interaction, every warning sign, and every piece of evidence before speaking. The process was methodical, reflective, and deliberate. A combination of rational analysis and moral intuition. In doing so, Jake exemplified the difficult intersection of intellect and emotion, of duty and grief, that defines human responses to extreme trauma. The consequences of the declaration were immediate. Nick, now publicly disowned by his elder brother, faced not only legal scrutiny, but a profound social and emotional rupture. Family gatherings, once spaces of shared history and connection, were now impossible without acknowledging the fracture. Relationships that had seemed secure were suddenly unstable. And for Jake and Romy, the challenge became navigating grief while simultaneously enforcing moral boundaries, a delicate balance few are prepared to manage. From a broader perspective, Jake's step forward highlights the complex interplay between family, morality, and public perception. In high-profile tragedies, every action is scrutinized, every word is analyzed, and every choice carries amplified consequences. Jake's decision to publicly disown his brother exemplifies the courage required to act ethically under pressure, even when the stakes are profoundly personal. And yet, even as the world reacted, Jake's personal struggle continued. The disownment was not a moment of triumph. It was a painful acknowledgement of betrayal, a recognition that the family would never be the same. Every memory, every shared experience with Nick was now colored by suspicion, grief, and moral judgment. The emotional labor involved in enforcing such a decision is immense, and Jake's journey was only beginning. As the days and weeks following the announcement unfolded, the narrative expanded. Media outlets dissected Jake's words, analysts debated the implications, and social media erupted with speculation. But beneath the headlines, Jake navigated a private reality: the need to reconcile grief, enforce justice, and protect the integrity of the remaining family. His decision was not only a legal or social act, it was a moral anchor, a statement of principle, and a signal that some truths cannot be ignored, even when they come at great personal cost. In essence, Jake Reiner stepped forward not merely to make a statement, but to assert moral clarity in a landscape dominated by grief, suspicion, and uncertainty. His public declaration of disownment was the culmination of careful reflection, ethical reasoning, and emotional courage. It represents a rare moment of decisiveness in the face of unimaginable tragedy, a moment that forever reshaped the Reiner family dynamic and set the stage for the unfolding legal, emotional, and public drama. But even as Jake took this step, the story was far from over. Questions remained. How would Nick respond? How would the public perceive the fractured family? And what hidden truths, yet to be revealed, might further complicate the narrative? Jake had made his move, but the next chapter of the Reiner family saga was poised to unfold in ways no one could have anticipated. The eldest son had stepped forward, but the moral and emotional reckoning was only beginning. And what came next would challenge everything the family thought they knew about loyalty, justice, and the meaning of family. The Reiner family was no longer the family the world had known. The murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner, combined with Nick's arrest and Jake's public disownment, had created an emotional and moral fissure that ran deeper than anyone outside the estate could imagine. What had once been a unit of love, shared memories, and unspoken trust was now a fractured landscape of grief, suspicion, and moral reckoning. And within this fractured terrain, every decision, every word, every memory became loaded with meaning, consequence, and risk. It's important to understand how quickly family fractures can deepen in the wake of tragedy. The initial shock of loss is often shared. Grief can unite even the most divided households. But when suspicion enters, especially suspicion directed at a blood relative, the dynamics shift dramatically. Trust, once assumed, is now questioned. Memories are reinterpreted. Actions that were once benign become potential warnings. And in the Reiner family, that process was accelerated by public scrutiny, legal pressure, and the high-profile nature of the tragedy. Romy, who had acted decisively in calling the police, found herself navigating an increasingly complex emotional landscape. She was still grieving her parents, still processing the horror of what she had discovered, and now had to contend with the ramifications of Jake's disownment. In one sense, she was aligned with Jake, understanding the moral necessity of the decision. But emotionally, the fracture within the family weighed heavily. Even when siblings share ethical clarity, grief has a way of creating unexpected tensions, particularly when a brother is publicly shunned.